Well, thank you very much. That's very, very kind and generous introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to be in this marvellous city and marvellous university with marvellous friends. So it's excellent. Even having to do a lecture is worth that price. I'm so envious of David's singing. I, like Yeats, am tone deaf, and so when I say I'm not going to sing, you ought to give me applause right now. I used occasionally to forget myself in the car and start singing, at which point my 3 children in the back seat will begin to chant the child abuse phone number, which they threatened they would phone as soon as we stopped to get petrol. So I know better than even to try to begin. Well, quite rightly, what I want to talk about this evening is the debt of Yeats to his father in his thinking, which really occurred after old man Yeats went to America. And as a kind of shorthand, because they're both called Yeats, I refer to the father as JBY, and Yeats usually as Yeats, occasionally WBY, but it just saves my confusion, if not yours. So shortly after John Butler Yeats arrived in New York, this was in 1908, Rollin Kirby, who was a local cartoonist, assured the artist John Sloane that Yeats was, this is old man Yeats, was a failure and presented, as he put it, an awful example of the artist's life. Great welcome. Sloane responded angrily in his diary, "A failure? The idiot. Mr. Yeats is a tremendous success. He has lived and had the poet's joy. He has known people. He is still young in spirit and attracts young people around him." These conflicting views of John Butler Yeats divided both those who knew him and they've divided later critics. Until fairly recently, Kirby's assessment was generally accepted. After all, he was an artist who found it as difficult to finish commissions as he did to charge enough for them, and a father who, for the greater part of his life, survived on handouts from his children and his friends. Such views seem to be corroborated by his own disarming admissions. In his case, he said, the impulse of tomorrow contradicted the impulse of today. And he confessed to John Quinn, an Irish-American lawyer, and his generous benefactor later, that the weakness in my character is distrust of any kind of personal success. Above all, these views were reinforced by a very powerful voice, that of his famous son, the poet William Butler Yeats, who wrote that his father's, and this is what Yeats said, infirmity of will, which has prevented him from finishing his pictures and ruined his career. He even hates the sign of will in others. The qualities which I thought necessary to success in art or in life seemed to him egotism or selfishness or brutality. I had to escape this family, drifting, innocent and helpless. But if the young Yeats eluded the physical ambience of his family, he could not, and nor in the end, I think, did he wish to, escape the pervasive influence of his father's thinking. It was with the publication of William Murphy's magisterial biography, Prodigal Father, a wonderful title, in 1978, that commentators began to take John Butler Yeats more seriously and to realize that if he was a failure, he was one of the most successful failures in modern artistic and literary history. Self-doubting but courageous in confronting those doubts, wide in his sympathies but shrewd in his judgment, he was alert to the vulnerabilities of others because he himself was so vulnerable. The crucial event in his life was his marriage to Susan Pollexfen, about which David has spoken. He had been fascinated by Charles and especially George Pollexfen, the sons of well-to-do ship and mill-owning family in Sligo, while they were all schoolfellows. And visiting them, almost on a whim, he surprised himself by proposing to their sister. His fascination with the Pollexfens, did he marry Susan or George or even all of them, remained with him long after most of them were dead, and he was 3,000 miles away in New York. His correspondence with his family, and especially with W B Yeats, returns insistently to recollections, descriptions, and analysis of them. In marrying into the Pollexfen family, he was marrying into all that was opposite and indeed often opposed to his own nature and attitude to life. But they intrigued him because of this very otherness. He regretted very much, as he later told his son, their surly contempt for courtesy and politeness, but not their want of education, he said. So much was I impressed by their indwelling seriousness. He found in this seriousness both inchoate passion and an inarticulate poetry which transcended, although they were not aware of it, their apparent dedication to money and worldly success. By his marriage into the silent brooding Pollexfens, he had, he proclaimed, given tongue to the sea cliffs. In the light of the achievements of his talented children, it is difficult not to endorse that claim, but the gift came at some cost. The undisguised and persistent scorn of his in-laws at his lack of financial and material success, though he could rationalize it, undermined his self-respect, and the growing temperamental differences with his wife, aggravated on her part by the tribulations of running a household perpetually on the edge of indigence, overshadowed his domestic life. If the threat of poverty and the difficulties of making ends meet troubled him less than his wife, this was not through mere irresponsibility, but because his background and upbringing had instilled in him a very different scale of values from that of the Pollexfens. The son and grandson of clergymen, he had, as he recalled, an idyllic childhood. And it is possible that he might have adopted his family tradition and himself found contentment as a reflective and much cherished rector of some country parish. But like many of his generation, he came under the influence of the utilitarian philosopher John Stuart Mill and the French positivist Auguste Comte, and later of Charles Darwin, and by the time he entered Trinity College, Dublin, in 1857, he had rejected religious faith in favour of a sceptical positivism, a philosophical position he retained until his death. So instead of the pulpit, he chose the bar, not the public bar, but the legal bar, I should hasten to say, and embarked on what promised to be a prosperous career in the law. Prosperous then, as indeed now. Though one wonders if a man of his tolerant sympathies could ever have shown the ruthlessness that needed by a successful barrister. But his heart, in any case, was not in legal work. And shortly after his marriage, in 1863, ignoring the disapproval of the Pollexfens, and notwithstanding the financial demands of a growing family, he abandoned the Inns of Court for Heatherley's art school. Exchanging the security of law for the hazardous life of the painter involved more than economic uncertainty. Coming, as he saw it, late to art, it was a long time before he could convince himself that he had sufficiently mastered his technique, and this further eroded his confidence. He paid for his art classes and school by taking out mortgages on Thomastown, a very modest estate he'd inherited. But it was a bad time to be a landlord in Ireland, Land League and agrarian unrest general, and that income had so dwindled by 1886 that he resolved to sell the property to his tenants. The proceeds turned out almost inevitably to be far smaller than he had anticipated, and since he was making very little from his paintings, it was all quickly swallowed up by his debts. He was to look back upon this period of his life as one of, as he put it, incessant humiliation. He moved his family back and forth between London and Ireland in a vain quest for wealthy clients. Why is he not making money in Dublin? Because the money is all in London. So he goes to London. Why is he not making it in London? Because he's not known there, has friends and acquaintances back in Dublin, so back to Dublin and back and forth and back and forth. While these disruptions, I think, sharpened his children's sense of their Irish identities, they made him no richer. Despairing of portrait work, he tried to make what money he could by illustrations for magazines and books, and even turned his hand unsuccessfully to writing stories. And then, shortly after the family's second return to London in 1887, Susan Yeats, his wife, suffered the first of a number of strokes that were to leave her an invalid for the rest of her life. As her son William was to put it later, it was like a long fading out. And 13 years later, on 3rd of January 1900, she died. Although he was deeply affected by her death, it was for John Butler Yeats a liberation. And when, in October 1901, a Dublin exhibition of his and Nathaniel Hone's pictures, organised by his friend Sarah Purser, turned out to be a palpable success, artistically, if not financially, he went back to live in Ireland. The following year, his two daughters also moved to Dublin to help set up the Dun-Ema Craft Industries and the Koala Press, and settled with their father in the suburb of Churchtown. Over the following years, he executed portraits or sketches of many of the literary and political leaders in Ireland, most commissioned by friends such as Lady Gregory and her nephew, the picture dealer and patron of the arts, Hugh Lane. But he never felt part of the Irish art establishment, and his support for Hugh Lane's proposed Dublin Gallery of Municipal Art, or Modern Art, I should say, it's a municipal gallery of modern art, brought him into open conflict with most members of the Royal Hibernian Academy. On the 21st of December 1907, using money collected by friends to send him on a trip to Italy, where he could study the old masters, so they'd had a whip round, instead he decided to accompany his daughter Lily to an Irish exhibition in New York, where she was exhibiting Dun-Ema manufacturers. And when he got there, he liked New York so much that he stayed on when she returned to Dublin, moving in September 1909 to the Petipas sisters' boarding house. These were some pleasant French Breton ladies who ran this boarding house on West 29th Street, and there he remained until his death. In February 1911, John Quinn commissioned him to paint a self-portrait, an assignment that gave him the excuse to remain in America. He worked on the picture for the rest of his life, leaving it characteristically still unfinished at his death. From New York, he wrote regularly to his children, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times a day, unfolding his ideas on life, art, and literature. The vigour and shrewdness of his correspondence gradually began to impress, as we'll see, and influence his son William, who saw him on visits to New York in 1911 and 1914, and who helped to support him through a deal whereby he sold his manuscripts to John Quinn on a regular basis. Ezra Pound's selection, Passages from the Letters of John Butler Yeats, appeared in 1917 and received good reviews, including one from T.S. Eliot. Despite being knocked down by a delivery cart in 1915, a severe attack of influenza followed by pneumonia in November 1918, and the concerted efforts of his family and John Quinn to persuade him to return to Ireland, he remained tenaciously alive and obdurately in America, meeting the new Mrs. W B Yeats there when she accompanied his son on a tour in 1920. Although he kept his intelligence and wit to the end, he went into a physical decline from the middle of 1921, and in February 1922, age 82, and with the princely sum of $14 in his bank account, he died. Well, the question I want to address now is, why did he stay in New York? Why was it at this time that he and his son began to take an increasingly engaged interest in what each other had to say about art and about life, and perhaps to ruminate on how these questions are linked? In many ways, one might see his move to New York as part of a pattern he had adopted throughout life, that the grass would always be greener or the commissions more lucrative and plentiful elsewhere. Following this hope, as I've said, he'd moved to London in the early 70s, back to Dublin in 81, returned to London in 1887, back to Dublin in 1900. Moreover, the grass in the Dublin he had left behind in 1907 had not been particularly green. His Dublin exhibition of 1901 had been a great success in raising his profile, but not a financial success. He made a bare living in Dublin, but this was mainly due to commission from friends. This was depressing, humiliating, and frustrating. In borrowing £3 from his son in 1906, he remarked that it was very painful to me to be always so unsuccessful, but I know I am doing good work. And in the same year, he observed that the £50 a year he could manage to pay his daughters did not even begin to cover the cost of his board and lodging. Since, as we've mentioned, his support for Lane's Municipal Gallery brought him into conflict with the Irish art establishment and intensified the already existing animosity towards him held by Sir Thomas Drew and Stephen Catterson Smith, respectively President and Secretary of the Royal Irish Academy, it seemed unlikely that any official recognition would come soon. And in a wider perspective, he complained in a letter to WBY of the city's narrow sectarianism, through which an inward-looking and self-protecting Protestant middle class abrogated jobs for themselves and for their cronies. It so happened that his son, too, was growing disillusioned with Dublin. In its hostility to the Abbey Theatre, and particularly the plays of Synge, in its refusal to finance Lane's gallery, and by the attitude of the employers towards the workers in the city, culminating in a prolonged lockout in 1913. All these things disillusioned W B Yeats, who expressed this feeling in a series of poems originally and significantly entitled Poems Written in Discouragement, and later incorporated into his book Responsibilities, published in 1914. In looking for a term which summed up the attitudes in Dublin of this time, Yeats seized upon an expression suggested by his father. And this is something which happens quite often, that actually phrases, sentiments, words in some of Yeats's poems first appear several months or years before in his father's letter. In this case, it was the word spite. Writing on 16 March 1913, John Butler Yeats had announced that spite is to Ireland what selfishness is to England. And he went on to elaborate that, as he put it, the first is barbarism, the other civilization such as it is. Spite is an entirely disinterested desire to destroy success wherever you see it. Selfishness likes success, for therein it sees some opportunity for itself. Spite was just the term WBY had been looking for in his current quarrel with Dublin, and a few months later he used it to effect in a poem, Pordine, written in September of that year. Indignant at the fumbling wits, the obscure spite of our old Pordine in his shop, I stumbled blind among the stones and thorn trees under morning light. And he retained and recalled the term in a poem written 2 years later, The People, which begins, "What have I earned for all that work?" I said, "for all that I have done at my own charge, the daily spite of this unmannerly town, where who has served the most is most defamed, the reputation of his lifetime lost between the night and morning." But if JBY's decision to leave Dublin was prompted by negative feelings very akin to those of his son, the desire to be no more a financial burden on his daughters, these were obviously motives, but what really animated him was his incurable optimism. Dining with Quinn and a lawyer friend of Quinn's called Delahunty shortly after his arrival in America, he tried, as he told his son in a letter, to explain to him the difference to me between living in Dublin and living in New York. "Ah, I see," said Delahunty. "In Dublin it is hopeless insolvency, here it is hopeful insolvency." Rather neatly put, JBY observed, and quite true. One suspects that at this dinner, as at pretty well all the other ones when they were together, it was Quinn who picked up the tab. John Quinn is our great standby. He wrote to WBY in 1908. And so he continued to be, and this is greatly to credit to Quinn, even after he and W B Yeats fell out over Quinn's mistress in 1909 and did not communicate with each other until March 1914. And during all this rather bitter time of animosity, Quinn did actually still go looking after the always impecunious father. The other great standby, besides Quinn, was, of course, W B Yeats himself. "Your name has been my great open sesame," JBY wrote in the summer of 1908, and then, bethinking his own dignity, added, "at least at first. Now I think I have a little position of my own." Certainly he did gain a position as a conversationalist, an after-dinner speaker, even as a writer of articles and sometime artist in New York, but he continued to call on the twin purses of his son and Quinn throughout his time in America, and it was their support which enabled him to remain there. For the question of whether to stay or to return to Ireland continued to perplex him. "I do not want to know what to do," he said. "To leave New York is to leave a huge fare, when at any moment I might meet with some huge bit of luck. Then again, I can't sleep at all. I am like the children of Israel who were not allowed to have plans, only their trust in Jehovah, and that he would provide manna the next morning." Well, as I said, in the event, it was Quinn and WBY who provided the manna, and after their reconciliation in 1914, and after WBY had given his father a considerable sum to pay off his lodging house debts and get his teeth fixed, the two guardians reached this deal whereby Yeats sent his manuscripts to Quinn. It's a sort of sophisticated kind of barter. And it was not just this direct support that was of value to John Butler Yeats. At the beginning of the summer of 1908, 6 months into his arrival, JBY announced that for the first time in my life, I am a success. I used to say I should never be successful without a position, and that therefore success was impossible. Now, thanks to your name, I have this position. Your name. The discovery of the huge reputation that WBY was already enjoying in America led him to reread his son's work in a new light and to reappraise his poetry and aesthetically more seriously than hitherto. I am lecturing on you next Friday, he wrote, also in 1908, and have been to the Johnsons to learn something about you. So he'd gone around to his son's school friend to find out, who his son was. Now, of course, he'd had a seminal influence on the shaping of his son's ideas while he was growing up, an influence that Yeats acknowledges and describes in the opening section of his autobiographies called Reveries Over Childhood and Youth. His father's passionate readings of heroic and dramatic poems and novels, particularly Balzac, had a lasting influence on Yeats throughout his life. He never, his son recalled, read me a passage because of its speculative interest, and indeed did not care at all for poetry where there was generalization or abstraction, however impassioned. And of course, JBY disliked rhetoric. But his reading to Yeats of Thoreau's Walden inspired his son to write The Lake Isle of Innisfree, rather to his chagrin, his most famous and favourite poem. And JBY's early pre-Raphaelite painting, he started his artistic career as a pre-Raphaelite and then gone against the pre-Raphaelites. But Yeats is always a pre-Raphaelite. The son was always a pre-Raphaelite and liked his father's earlier paintings for that reason. And they spurred him at Yeats's early attempts at poetic drama. But the father disliked lyrical poetry of personal utterance. And it was when WBY began to study psychical research and mystical philosophy that I broke away, as he puts it, from my father's influence. His father's influence also declined when WBY left the family house in late 1894. And moreover, WBY seemed to be moving in directions of which his father disapproved. He viewed the influence of Lady Gregory with some caution, and the effect of Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, whom the younger Yeats had read avidly in 1902 and 1903, well, JBY considered this even more worthy of concern. Thus, the relationship between the two, although usually cordial and respectful, was not always harmonious. In Lily and Jack Yeats, to his younger children, JBY found gentleness and kindliness. His daughter Lolly was more difficult, but he forgave her because she had inherited more of the Pollexfen blood, and her personality, therefore, made life hard for her. But WBY was an enigma, half Yeats, but also half Pollexfen, and with a willfulness that on occasion perplexed his father as much as it alarmed him. There's a nice story when, JBY always out of pocket in New York, and one day, unexpected, his son sent him £10, and he sat down and wrote to his sister, Lily Yeats, JBY's daughter. He said, "It was marvellous," he said, "so kind of Willie to send the money. To send the money like that, unasked, shows he's a Yeats." To have it to send shows he's a pollux. So, although proud of his son, he also found him at times overbearing, and much of his epistolary reflections on poets and poetry are aimed at curbing this aspect of his son's temperament, but in doing so, they open out into larger questions of who is poetry for and what kind of poetry is fitting for the modern age. During a quarrel between Yeats and his sister Lily over the conduct of the Koala Press in 1905, 2 years before he'd sailed for America, JBY complained of his son's offensive letters and imperious tone. As you have dropped affection from the circle of your needs, have you also dropped love between man and woman? Is this the theory of the overman? If so, your demigodship is after all but a doctrinaire demigodship. And then he goes on magnificently, your words are idle, and you are far more human than you think. You would be a philosopher and are really a poet. The men whom Nietzsche's theory fits are only great men of a sort of Yahoo greatness. Earlier, and rather less rhetorically, he had confided to his daughter Lily that he wished W.E.Y. had Jack Yeats's tender, gracious manner and did not sometimes treat me as if I were a black beetle. This was a genuine and not merely personal concern. JBY was afraid that these traits, backed up by his admiration for Nietzsche, might lead his son to become too critical, too scornful of ordinary life and people, and too philosophical. Once in New York, and with only intermittent commissions, and thus a lot of time on his hands, and equipped with a very energetic intellect, JBY began to write letters which set out the gifts and attributes that, he insists, make true poetry true. And he does this not only with his son's work in mind, but also with the consciousness of the way America going and the world order seems to be developing. Thus he writes on 7th of January 1909, been in America about a year by then, to accuse his son of becoming critic-ridden, and advises him that the cure is, of course, to grow interested in life. A little later, he tells him that his true gift, Yeats's true gift, is not the malignity of criticism and self-importance, but benignity. I think the reason you have the popular gift is because your talent is benign. That is its essential quality. Critics are malign. So are aristocracies and pessimists. It is the whole of Nietzsche. So are college dons, well, that was certainly true, and their retinue. But so were not Shakespeare or Shelley. And he adds rather complacently, this benign quality you get from me. Now, Yeats became receptive to his father's ideas at this time because he was radically revising his style and aesthetic. Looking back on these years later in life, he pronounced that then, in 1900, everyone got down off his stilts, that poetry, art came, as it were, more down to earth. Hitherto, Yeats had been a symbolist who put high value on the visionary nature of the poet. Now, as he recorded in 1908, the year in which his father's letters from America began, he needed to find out if I am a romantic of some kind or only an ignorant man puzzled at the middle of a revolution that has changed all about him. One of the aspects of his romantic heritage was the place of vision in his aesthetic. Hitherto, as a symbolist, he had placed creative emphasis almost entirely on the imagination, as seizing on truths not available to the waking and deliberate mind. But he now saw that a too complacent surrender to imagination could lead to flaccidity unless the will intervened to force the artist to rigor in his craft. He put this point to a friend of his, W.T. Horton, a symbolist artist, in July 1901, instructing him that in art, as in the spiritual life, the will is all but all. One of the temptations, he says, is a full spirituality which offers the soul ease. And he advised Horton to turn from the visions for a while. In sending his friend A.E., George Russell, a book of critical essays, Ideas of Good and Evil, in 1903, he told him that the close of the previous century, i.e. the 19th century, was, as he put it, full of a desire to get out of form, to get to some kind of disembodied beauty, but that now, he said, the contrary impulse has come. I feel about me and in me an impulse to create form. In contrast to Ideas of Good and Evil, the book of essays that Yeats was then working on, which was published about a decade later, called The Cutting of an Agate, is full of the notion that vision must be focused in and through the body and in and through vivid personalities. He had, he says in the book, come to this certainty. What moves natural man in the arts is what moves them in life, and that is intensity of personal life. But this raised a further set of questions. If the passionate personality of the artist and his creations was to be the touchstone of art, what were the consequences if the artist's energy and desire outraged the conventional moralities of the day, as had happened notoriously in the case of John Millington Synge, playwright and friend of Yeats, whose plays had been howled down at the Abbey Theatre? Was the unruly imagination to be governed and limited by an exercise of will? It was his father's attempt to address this very question, independently in a way of his own approach to it, that led his son to begin to take his father's ideas seriously. He had at first been dismissive of the old man, writing in October 1908, "No, I do not understand your dramatic ideas any more than you understand the ideas of my generation." But his father persevered. In February of the following year, Yeats was arrested by a striking similarity in his and his father's thinking. He explained to his father that he was writing scattered essays with no plan. And curiously enough, these were later published as discoveries, and curiously enough, I had written in my big notebook, "Genius vanishes at the first breath of ambition." The very next day, he goes on, brought me your letter with the same words, because in a letter of January 1909, JBY had said that, let's put it, ambition sets up external standards. By ambition, the rebel angels fell, and so do the artists. So gradually there is a more serious view of his father, and when his father, in a letter of early 1910, told his son that in a recent lecture he had pointed out that there was a continual antagonism between human nature and the willpower, and that in England the willpower has conquered, with the result that the people have become marked with the servile stamp, their human feelings crushed under the power of will, which is practical and commercial, together with that which is moral, working to enslave man. Since Shakespeare's time, he went on, poets have ceased to create human personalities. The business of creation is left to humorists. The supremacy of the willpower infers the malediction of human nature. By now, his son was sitting up and taking notice. The letters, as I say, he wrote to his father in the first years of New York are affectionate, gossipy, and amusing, but now he begins to engage with the ideas in excited way. Thus, in February, it's not only that he found his father's ideas increasingly fascinating and influential, because they elaborated his own thinking. That what old man Yeats was doing was giving him tips, pushing him a little further, rather, I think, than ever inaugurating something completely new. And thus it was in February 1910, just having got this letter, he wrote, "I thought your letter most wonderful. It came at a moment when I was busy with an almost similar problem, and it clarified my thought a great deal. In fact, I may read some of it, I conclude you will not mind, at the end of a lecture I am to give in a private drawing room in London next month." Nor was this merely humouring the old man, because Yeats at the same time wrote to Lady Gregory that he had had a wonderful letter from my father elaborating his ideas about will and personality. And J.B. went on to write about personality, and he said he maintained that all great men and all interesting men have the personality uppermost, with intellect as guide and critic, and the moral nature as executive. The personality being the original principle of growth and pushing itself into consciousness. And he went on to confess, the difficulty is how to define personality. One can only say that it is in conscious life what is called mother wit, and it is vision with great men on great occasions. Now, Yeats took all these ideas up, but as we'll see, gave them a slight tweak. On the 23rd of February, he wrote to tell his father how the lectures that he was giving in London had gone. There were 3 lectures in all on contemporary poetry and drama. All 3 lectures, he wrote, have worked themselves out as a plea for uniting literature once more to personality, the personality of the writer in lyric poetry, or with the imaginative personalities in drama. The only ground on which I differ from you is that I look upon character and personality as different things, or perhaps different forms of the same thing. Juliet has personality, her nurse has character. I look upon personality as the individual form of our passions. Character, I think, belongs to comedy, but all that's rather a long story and is connected with a whole mass of definitions. And he goes on, in process of writing my 3rd lecture, which was on the contemporary Irish theatre, given on the 11th March 1910 at the Adelphi Club with George Bernard Shaw in the chair, he says, I found that your letter led up, while I was writing this, it led up to the thought of your letter, which I am going to quote at the end. It has made me realize with some surprise how fully my philosophy of life has been inherited from you in all but its details and applications. And so he did in this lecture. Yeats quotes his father's argument, proposing that England could only produce an art of the will, but the backward places, i.e. Ireland and Sicily, gave us the art of personality, of impulse unsubdued by will. Comedy, he said, was the expression of character, and it was Shakespeare's great achievement that he added comedy to tragedy. He was a tragic comedian, but in all his tragedy, character gave way to comedy in the end, and we saw the defect not of a man, but of human nature itself. The whole... he said, I found it led up to your, the thought of your letter, which I'm going to quote at the end. It has made me realize with some surprise how, I've said this, how been inherent in all its applications. Now, the whole mess of definitions which Yeats speaks of was of much concern to him at this time. His father's discussions and speculations had touched, as I said, questions perplexing his son since the turn of the century, when attacks on him, and even worse, limp attempts to imitate his Celtic style, obliged him not merely to defend but to redefine his position. And in this process of redefinition, he was laboriously evolving a new critical terminology. Imagination and passion, as they were always with him, are still paramount, the paramount agencies indeed of the artist. But imagination and passion are now seen to require more focus and control. And all this is evolving against the growing fear that modern society was atrophying, sinking to the lowest common denominator. As Ronan said earlier, all modernists attack modernity, and that it was the artist's duty to bring back passion and energy, the wasteful virtues which he celebrates in his book of poems, Responsibilities, the wasteful virtues which earn the sun. In this long evolution of his ideas on these questions, his father's constant commentary was of the greatest value. Indeed, so frequent and speculative were his father's letters that in July 1913 he confessed that he was afraid he sometimes take full advantage of your filial indulgence and write nonsense. Some measure of Yeats's attention to his father's thought and advice may be adduced from his apparent reading of Erasmus during the dark days of 1913, the years in which Lane's Municipal Gallery apparently foundered and the Great Dublin lockout soured social and political life in Ireland. JBY in New York commiserated. You are engaged in the age-long battle of ignorance and knowledge, intellect and stupidity. And he recommended that WBY should read Froude's Life and Letter of Erasmus. Yeats apparently did so, and it was this that produced the final striking lines of the last poem in Responsibilities, where he ends up recalling those undreamt accidents that have made me notorious till all my priceless things are but a post the passing dogs defile. And Ezra Pound said, "Yippee, Willie, with that line you've become into the modern world." But in fact, what Pound didn't realise was that Yeats had actually got the line from one of Erasmus's letters, and that he'd been to Erasmus' letter because of his father's tip. But more important was JPY's attempt in 1914 to get his son to use his forthcoming visit to America to combat what JBY saw as the two faults in American culture, the pursuit of a banal happiness and the desire for a bogus spiritual uplift in poetry and art, a sort of emaciated Emersonianism, I suppose. If desire was the essence of Yeats's and all true poets' inspiration, it was, JBY argued, desire for growth. In one aspect, he found in America a culture dedicated to growth, but a dangerous inclination towards opinion and abstract morality that he mistrusted. In a lecture to the Vagabond Club, he contested, as he informed his son, that the summum bonum was not virtue, pleasure or happiness, but growth and the cosmic movement towards growth, and development working on the conscious mind that produced literature, art, and music. He worried that to be a man of intellect in the USA was to have opinions entertained not for intellectual happiness, but for the sake of moral progress and action. The Americans are the most idealistic people in the world, he said, and the least poetical. His son was delighted with this. You may have thought I was not interested in your letter, he replied, because I did not reply to some of the criticism in it. The criticism interested me greatly. It is just the sort of letter I delight getting from you. One of the reasons he had not written by return was that he could not actually read his father's handwriting, literally. I mean, Yeats's handwriting is terrible. The Son's, the poet's handwriting is terrible. He says, the only good thing about his bad handwriting and its hides is even worse spelling. But his father's being an artist, it looks very neat at first sight. Oh, after the Son, no problem. Then when you look at it, it's so small, and that actually I've read, transcribed thousands of his letters, and the reason I'm not blind, I don't know why. So what did Yeats do? He adopted the habit, also practiced by John Quinn, to whom JBY wrote incessantly, sending all his father's letters off to an unfortunate typist to be deciphered. During the First World War, of course, when transatlantic letters were censored, the father, JBY, was worried that this delay in censoring them meant that his letters were not getting through. But his son reassured him. Oh yes, I have all your letters and am very glad to have them. Some of them are on my table, typed. Others are at the typist's. Others will go there soon. One came to me with a little printed notice from the censor inside, suggesting that you should write more plainly. So even the censor, the Germans should have used him, obviously, as a... But in his approach to America in 1914, this was just, of course, before the war, J.B.Y. Yeats wrote a letter, now alas, lost, but J.B.Y. wrote and said, I don't think anything more important was ever said about art than that sentence in your letter, the practical man has illusions about life, the artist creates because he has none. A lecture of which every sentence was that sentence said in innumerable forms would make an immediate stir in America, destroying at one blow any quantities of bad art. Here it is either sentimental poetry, which is self-deception, or rhetorical poetry written to deceive others. And we may just pause here, because I go on and state the consequence of Yeats' thing. Sentimental poetry, self-deception, rhetorical poetry to deceive others. And just note how this suggestion influenced not only Yeats's thinking about art, but found way into his poetry. For some years later, W B Yeats recalled this observation in writing in his poem Hic and Illy. The rhetorician would deceive his neighbours, the sentimentalist himself, while art is but a vision of reality. If these ideas can be incorporated in your lectures, change no doubt in the process, I shall be glad, only if your lectures don't make any allusions to me. My individuality must not get in the way. This is J.B.Y. writing to Yeats on the eve of his arrival in America. He's sort of using his son as his own mask and mouthpiece. And in this, he succeeded. His son denounced uplift at a luncheon given in his honour by the New York Poetry Society on 10th of February 1914, and a few days later an excited J.B.Y. wrote to him that the Poetry Society at their next meeting are holding a debate on your speech. Your assertion that poets are not to uplift has roused a swarm of bees, with probably some wasps among them. When you return to New York, perhaps you might have something to say. And indeed, W.B.Y. did have more to say. In an interview printed in the New York Times of 22 February, he maintained that the new movement in poetry would be more purely one of art for art's sake than was the Victorian movement. The latter, he said, was obsessed by enthusiasm, by big ideas, and also by abstraction. And he went on to argue that as far as literature was concerned, Americans were still living in the Victorian period. In their concern with moral uplift, they were misunderstanding literature. Tennyson was great in spite of his moral enthusiasm, he says, not because of it. And he went on to add that he didn't suppose that there is any poet under 30 years of age in Europe today who knows whether he is a good man or a bad one. He has no duty but sincerity. This sense of sincerity was grounded, also come up in earlier letters from his father to him, and the insistence that one of the qualities is the intimacy with which the poet or artist talks to his audience. We must express ourselves to somebody, he said, the future or God Almighty, otherwise we should cease to express ourselves, and in the act of ceasing to express ourselves, perish. This was also a dilemma faced by his son, as he felt himself alienated from the Irish audience he desired, and in his poetry, The Fisherman, he does, in effect, what his father suggests in the letter and invents an ideal reader to address. And he replied to JBY that he was delighted with your letter insisting on intimacy as the mark of fine literature. The contrary thing to this intimacy, which is another name for experience or life, is, I believe, generalization, and generalization creates rhetoric, wins immediate popularity, organizes the mass, gives political success, Kipling's poetry, Macaulay's essays, and so on. Life is never the same twice, and so cannot be generalized. And in a letter of his father's of 2nd July 1913, this letter stirred his son into making one of the most eloquent statements of his new aesthetical thinking to date. His father had suggested that Yeats was rather neglecting vision, and that his earlier poems had been all vision. It captured people, and went on to observe that poetry is a reaction from the imperfect to the perfect, the accompanying melody, whether of prose or verse, the effort to keep the pain alive and intensify it, since out of the heart of pain comes the solace. WBY replied very shortly to the letter that he thought it was the letter about pain bringing out solace most beautiful and profound. All our art is but the putting our faith and the evidence our faith into words or forms, and our faith is in ecstasy. Of recent years, instead of vision, meaning by vision the intense realization of a state of ecstatic emotion symbolized in a definite imagined region, I have tried for more self-portraiture. I have tried to make my work convincing with a speech so natural and dramatic that the hearer would feel the presence of a man thinking and feeling. There are always two types of poetry. Keats the type of vision, Burns a very obvious type of the other, too obvious indeed. Again and again, both Yeats and his father used sort of de-cinemization as ways of approaching, breaking down questions, the difference between, as it were, wit and humour, or comedy and humour. He talks, Yeats, in a letter praising his father for doing this about humour, and recalls that he himself had written something similar in his 1907 essay.